In the shadowy chapters of history, vulnerable groups like prisoners, the disabled, and the impoverished were all too often used as mere tools in sinister research experiments. From being kept in the dark to being outright manipulated, their rights were blatantly disregarded. While today's standards, fortified by regulations set in place 4 decades ago by the US Congress, mandate informed consent, the past paints a far murkier picture. The era prior to 1974 witnessed shocking violations of ethics in the name of science. As we delve into the top 10 scary human experiment stories, brace yourself as we shine a light on studies so disturbing they become a turning point in how society views the ethics of scientific research. Number 10. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In the 1920s, syphilis was a significant public health concern. In response, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, a charitable organization, initiated a health project in 1928 aimed at aiding Black communities in the rural American South. However, the promising endeavor took a dark turn with the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, leading to a change in the project's focus. By 1932, impoverished Black men from Macon County, Alabama, were lured into a program promising treatment for their so-called bad blood, a term ambiguously used for various ailments, including syphilis. In return for participating, they were offered free medical care, food, and even burial insurance. However, the bitter truth was concealed from these men. They were unknowingly suffering from syphilis and were unwittingly enrolled in a deceptive government experiment titled the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The study aimed to observe the progression of untreated syphilis. Despite the participants believing they were obtaining genuine medical attention, they never received effective treatment for their condition. Astonishingly, even when penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis in 1945, the men in the study were still denied treatment. Concerns about the study's ethics surfaced as early as 1936, but it wasn't until a media expose in 1972 that the public learned of this shocking experiment, leading to widespread condemnation and the study's termination. Number 9. The Nazi Medical Experiments. During World War II, Nazi scientists conducted brutal medical experiments on inmates in concentration camps, such as Auschwitz and Dachau. These experiments, marked by extreme cruelty and abuse, were carried out under the pretense of advancing military knowledge, medical science, and racial theories. One of the primary motivations was to develop methods to aid their military. For example, prisoners were immersed in icy water to study survival rates of pilots in cold environments. Some were given only seawater, leading to their death from dehydration, as an experiment on sustenance at sea. Additionally, inmates were subjected to high-altitude conditions in decompression chambers, resulting in severe health complications or death. The Nazis also focused on pharmaceutical advancements. Prisoners' wounds were intentionally infected to test the efficacy of new treatments, like sulfanilamide. To comprehend diseases better, subjects were injected with tuberculosis, while others were poisoned to study the time taken for lethal outcomes. Furthering their racial ideology, the Nazis forcibly sterilized individuals, carried out experiments on twins, and conducted studies on people with dwarfism, underlining the depths of their dehumanizing agenda. Number 8. Watson's Little Albert Experiment. In 1920, researchers John Watson and Rosalie Rayner carried out a landmark study at Johns Hopkins University using a baby known as Little Albert. Their aim was to demonstrate that emotional reactions could be conditioned, supporting the theory that humans start as blank states. To test this, they introduced Albert to a white rat, which he initially showed no fear of. However, things changed when the researchers paired the rat's appearance with loud, startling noises. Repeated exposure to this combination made Albert fearful, not just of the rat, but also of other furry animals like dogs and monkeys. The true identity of Little Albert remained a mystery until 2010, when he was identified as Douglas Merritt. Merritt's life was tragically short and marred by health issues. He displayed signs of neurological problems, never managed to walk or speak, and died at 6 from hydrocephalus. Furthermore, he had a bacterial meningitis infection, which some speculate he might have gotten either unintentionally during his medical treatments, or, more controversially, as part of another deliberate experiment. The sad postscript is that Merritt was never freed from the conditional fears instilled during the study, and, with his premature death, it remains unknown if those fears persisted throughout his short life. Number 7. The Monster Study of 1939. In 1939, Mary Tudor and Wendell Johnson of the University of Iowa conducted an experiment on 22 orphans to explore the origins of stuttering. Their aim was to determine if negative reinforcement could induce stuttering as a learned behavior. The children were divided into 4 groups. Some actual stutterers received negative feedback, Others got positive reinforcement. Some non-stutterers were falsely told that they were starting to stutter and criticized, while the remainder of non-stutterers were praised. The experiment's significant outcome was the behavioral change in the criticized non-stutterers. They began showing low self-esteem and behaviors commonly seen in stutterers, though they never truly developed a stutter. The study concluded that criticism couldn't create actual stuttering, but could instill behaviors associated with it. Number 6. Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Study. During World War II, malaria afflicted an estimated 60 to 65% of U.S. soldiers in the South Pacific. In some units, the disease was more lethal than enemy combat, emphasizing the urgency of finding an effective treatment. Seeing anti-malarial drugs as vital for victory, an experiment began in 1944 at the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois. Over 2 years, over 400 prisoners were infected with malaria to test potential treatments. The experiment was transparent in its intentions, and the questionable ethics didn't seem to concern the American public, who were primarily focused on winning the war and ensuring the safety of the soldiers. Participants were informed of the experiment's purpose and were often lauded for their patriotic sacrifice. Many even received reduced prison terms for their involvement. Number 5. The Aversion Project in South Africa. During South Africa's apartheid era, residents faced not only state-enforced racial segregation, but also strict government regulation of their sexuality. A regime held strong anti-LGBTQ stances, viewing homosexuality as both a crime and a treatable disorder. Despite global shifts away from viewing homosexuality as a mental illness, South African authorities, including those in the South African Defense Force (SADF), clung to archaic beliefs and therapies. From 1969 to 1987, at the one military hospital in Pretoria, officials tried to reform those they deemed deviant. Gays, lesbians, and other LGBTQ individuals were given drugs and subjected to electroconvulsive therapy. They were exposed to same-sex erotic images, followed by electric shocks, and then shown heterosexual erotic images. When these painful and traumatic interventions predictably failed, individuals underwent hormone treatments, sometimes leading to chemical castration. Tragically, about 900 individuals also faced non-consensual gender reassignment surgeries, with some surgeries left incomplete. Number 4. Milgram shock experiments. In the fictional movie, Ghostbuster Pete Venkman conducts ESP electroshock experiments on students, which appears to draw inspiration from Stanley Milgram's renowned shock experiments from the early 1960s. In Milgram's tests, participants, believing they were involved in a Yale study about memory, acted as teachers and were directed to administer shocks to learners who were actually actors each time an error occurred. The perceived voltage increased with every mistake, reaching up to 450 volts. Surprisingly, around 2/3 of the participants obeyed instructions, delivering the highest perceived shocks. In truth, Milgram's study aimed to explore obedience to authority rather than memory or learning. No actual shocks were delivered. The study remains contentious even today. Some criticized its lack of realism, while others argue its findings are crucial for understanding human behavior under pressure. A replication of Milgram's experiment in 2010 yielded similar results, with roughly 70% of participants willing to administer the highest perceived shocks. Number 3. CIA Mind Control Experiments, Project MKUltra. Movies like Men Who Stare at Goats and The Manchurian Candidate hinted at a darker chapter in the CIA's past, involving secretive mind control experiments. Surprisingly, these portrayals weren't just fiction. During the Cold War, the CIA launched an initiative to develop super agents, individuals they could control for assassinations, and who would be resilient to enemy interrogations. This clandestine program, named MKUltra, involved administering psychedelic drugs such as LSD, PCP, and barbiturates to unwitting American and Canadian civilians. Beyond drug administration, other potentially illegal techniques like hypnosis and possibly the use of chemical, biological, and radiological agents were explored. Unbeknownst to them, several universities were used as conduits for these experiments. Shockingly, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs claimed that around 7,000 soldiers were subjected to these experiments without their informed consent. Spanning over 2 decades, the CIA allocated approximately $20 million to MKUltra. At least one death has been linked directly to these activities, and more are suspected. However, much of the evidence was lost when the CIA deliberately destroyed related records in 1973. Number 2. Unit 731. Despite the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning biological warfare, Japan overlooked it, speculating its effectiveness led to its prohibition. Until 731, concealed under the facade of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, began pathogenic and chemical warfare trials on humans by the 1930s. Victims were deliberately infected with diseases like anthrax, bubonic plague, and cholera to study their military application. Harrowing procedures, including vivisections, were performed without anesthesia on primarily Chinese, but also Russian and American subjects. It's believed that around 100,000 people perished within Unit 731, but when accounting for wider germ warfare incidents, like plague-infested fleas dropped over villages, casualties are estimated to be around 250,000. Astonishingly, post-World War II, the US granted immunity to those involved in Unit 731's atrocities in exchange for data, and Japan didn't acknowledge these events until the 1980s. Number 1. The human vivisections of Herophilus. The ancient doctor Herophilus, often hailed as the pioneer of anatomy, made significant medical breakthroughs. However, the methods he employed for his studies remain controversial. While working in Alexandria, Egypt, Herophilus was given permission during the tenure of the first 2 Ptolemaic pharaohs to publicly dissect human cadavers, an activity he pursued alongside fellow physician Erasistratus. Shockingly, this era saw criminals being condemned to dissection and even vivisection as a form of punishment. It's believed that Herophilus conducted vivisections on nearly 600 living prisoners. His investigations vastly advanced our understanding of the human anatomy, especially in areas like the brain, eyes, liver, and the circulatory and reproductive systems. These practices were especially controversial during a period when dissecting a human was deemed disrespectful to the deceased. Even though mummification was prevalent in Egypt, the act of vivisection on living beings was, much like today, considered inhumane and barbaric.